Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who don't know me, my name is George Marston. I'm Pro Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation here at Northumbria University. I also have executive responsibility for the estate, and I'm chair of the Sustainability Management Group within the university, which has some relevance to this evening's event. It's a real pleasure for me to welcome you here on behalf of Northumbria University to this evening's event. At Northumbria University, we aim to introduce our students to research-rich learning that brings them face-to-face with global challenges. We aim to equip our students to meet those challenges, and we aim to use research and innovation to enact pragmatic solutions to those challenges. On the top of our agenda is sustainability. That's why we're one of the first universities to put the Sustainable Development Goals at the heart of our research, teaching, and our strategy. It's why Professor Greta Defato was named by the Big Issue as one of Britain's top 100 change makers for her work on hunger. It's why we have cut carbon emissions by 48% over the last 4 years and are ranked 4th amongst UK universities for sustainability. It's why we're the only university in the North East to be ranked in the world's top 50 for business ethics research. And it's why we're delighted to welcome our honorary graduate, Polman, back to the university to speak to us. I should also say, it's why I came here on a bike. Although, this is not about me, obviously. Okay, right, so it's a miserable February evening. It's cold, there's been sleet and hail and snow and all kinds of stuff today. And I look around and there are students, there are my colleagues, there are people like Roy Sandbach here, my God. We've got journalists, we've got a whole range of people. And I think that tells you that really, I don't need to give Powell a very big introduction. You all know who he is. I'll mention just a couple of things, so if you excuse my French accent at least. He is Chevalier de la Légion d'Honneur. He's also a Knight of the British Empire. I think it's not an exaggeration to say his leadership at Unilever, his activism, his example and his record have established him as the world's most recognised champion of responsible business. Since leaving Unilever, he has created a foundation to combat poverty and climate change, rightly entitled Imagine, for some things must be believed before they can be seen. Powell has generously given us time today to talk with university leaders about how Northumbria can lead change in higher education. And he's also run a masterclass on change leadership with our MBA students. And now we're delighted to invite him to address us and to take questions on capitalism's reinvention. Colleagues and friends, please join me in welcoming Powell Polman.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, and it's good to see so many familiar faces. It brings me back to '95 when we came to Newcastle. I was replacing someone called Mike Clasper, who was running the company at that time, and we were actually 6 years in Spain before that. And he came to Spain to visit me because I didn't have any time for handovers and to explain the business and what I was going to run here with P&G in Gosforth. And he came off the plane, and it was in Spain, blue sky and nice temperatures, etc. And I said, Mike, did you bring your sunglasses? He said, I ain't got any. So then I knew I was really in trouble moving to Newcastle. Little did we know. But then it turned out to be probably one of our best experiences, was the hospitality that the Geordies are known for. And certainly I owe a lot to the people that I met here and the projects that we were involved in. And a very humble environment with people with both feet on the ground that have been an enormously important part in my own forming and also my philosophy on the way I run business, actually. Also very pleased here with the university because thanks to Irene Oxenheim, we will remember her tonight with a dinner. She unfortunately passed on not too long ago. And at that time, Lord Glenamara running the university. I had the honor to get an honorary degree here. I was not a very good student when I was in school. And I've discovered it's much easier to get honorary degrees. And so I've been concentrating on that since. And it's actually a very productive and good strategy. But you were the first ones that bestowed it upon me, even before the university I went to, quite some time ago already. But that was a clear honor. My mother, who's still alive actually, came from the Netherlands for that occasion, and she's still proud if she talks about it. She has, we have 6 children, so she has photos of all of them, because she's very careful not to favor one for another. But I can give you a secret that my photo was from the honorary degree that I got from the university, so it must be special for her as well. But anyway, thanks for all being here tonight, and thanks for what you are doing as a university. It was clearly explained how you're leading. The city actually was quite some aggressive plans to make the city a greener city and attack the burning issue of climate change that we have to deal with. And it's great again to see you taking the lead. The way that the university has increased in its rankings that we went over is quite impressive. And the imprint that you have here on the students, but the footprint that you have in society is quite admirable. And I've always had not only great affinity to the region, but also to the university here. And that's why it's an honor for me to be here with you. I've been asked to talk for about 20-25 minutes, I think, and then use the rest of the time for Q&As, but it will only work if you have Q&As. If you don't participate, I'm standing here, wasting my time. So I hope that we'll have a interactive session at the same time. I was actually looking at the title, we were talking it on the screen. If that's a 20-minute lecture, I think you can just read the title and I'm done. I'm still trying to figure out what it all means, but I'll try to stay close to that and hopefully explain some things to you. Let me just frame it a little bit. I think it's good to put the world context very simply in place, why it's an interesting world to live in, some of the challenges that we have to deal with, if we can boil that down to a few challenges that are relevant for you here tonight, and then why I think it's so important, even more so than in the past, how the private sector needs to change and play a bigger role in that. And obviously many of you, I saw some of you from the MBA program sitting here that we had the pleasure just talking with each other, had a great discussion. So I'll try to relate it a little bit very practically to what the role of companies is. And then at the end, perhaps we can wrap up, if the 20 minutes allow, 25 minutes, and talking a little bit about what type of leaders do we need to be able to succeed in tomorrow's society. Within that, I'll try to explain what we do with Imagine, which you will see ties in totally with what the world needs right now. If we succeed or not, the future will tell. But I know there's an enormous need out there. Give me a sign if about 25 minutes is up, so that I don't eat in your time. 1859, Paris and London. Charles Dickens. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. A tale of two cities. But it talks about the spring of hope and the winter of despair. And I think that's a good reflection of where we are today in the world. You know, it's a great world to be born in. There are actually more people educated than ever. People live longer than ever. People access to basic services, be it clean drinking water or sanitation, is higher than it has ever been. Every day in this world, 230,000 people get access to clean drinking water or sanitation. Every day in this world, about 250,000 people get lifted out of poverty. In fact, in the last 3 decades, we have lifted more people out of poverty than any time in human history. Kofi Annan, who was the Secretary General at the UN before Ban Ki-moon in the year 2000, started something which he called the Millennial Development Goals, where we had 8 goals. Some of you might remember that still. And where he said, why don't we use the next 15 years, which was from 2000 to 2015, to halve the number of people in this world living in poverty, which at that time was defined as $1.25 a day. And lo and behold, we've actually achieved that. China being a big part of that, but we've achieved that. We've never ever lifted so many people out of poverty. If you want to be born in this wonderful world, you should be born today. But at the same time, I also think it's increasingly a challenging world, the tale of two cities. The way we've moved these people out of poverty. The speed with which that has happened, add to that the population growth, has put an enormous pressure on some of the things that we probably hadn't foreseen. When we were only a 1 or 2 billion population, which was probably less than 100 years ago, by the way, how quickly we are growing, and we were more or less in balance with modern nature, many of the challenges that we face today are not showing up. It's only because of this enormous explosive growth of lifting these people out of poverty that we're starting to actually discover now that the way we're doing that is frankly not sustainable. And it's not that some people never thought about it or that our predecessors were dumb. It's just that it's creeping up to us at a very, very fast pace. In the financial crisis that we had in 2006, 2007, I think people realized when the stock market goes up every year by 5 or 10%, which you see again happening now because of all this money being pumped in with quantitative easing, but when the stock market went up in the early 2000s, not many people asked themselves questions. It was only when we had this crash, what we called the financial crisis, which became an economic crisis, which then became a political crisis, that we started to ask ourselves questions, what is going on here? And what we discovered, I think, not surprisingly, that a system that is dependent on high levels of government or private debt, overconsumption by a small part of the world's population, and frankly leaving too many people behind is not a sustainable system. I would argue that any system where too many people feel that they're left behind or that they're not participating will ultimately rebel against itself. And that is what you see happening. As I talk here now, about 15 countries in the world, more than we've seen in a long time in human history, people are on the street protesting. If you look at election results in the US or here, not to go into the Brexit discussions obviously, but you see there's enormous angst and polarization coming in. And that's really because too many people in this world feel that this world is increasingly stacked against them. If you look at America itself, in the last 4 decades, if you want to, the absolute income levels have not really changed for the bulk of the American people. We're eroding the middle class, to be honest. And as you erode the middle class, which is also happening in this country, where you have a few very rich and then the rest is poor, you undermine democracy. And that's what you see happening in the political systems, played out in many countries in the world, may I add. But what happened in the US was people did not see their incomes go up, but meanwhile housing or healthcare or education, all these costs went up. So I would argue that people feel poorer. Add to that technology and the uncertainty of the future. Am I going to be relevant? The angst of not seeing your generations that come after you having it better, which was an automatic assumption. Now you really have to question that. Causes a lot of friction, causes a lot of angst. That angst is getting translated into politics, where you see populism, nationalism, where you see countries as a result shrinking back to their own borders, if you want to. And Brexit, a great example of that. The US or the numerous trade conflicts that we see in the world, equally great examples of that. And frankly, putting more pressure on a system that needs to change. In the past, we were dependent on politicians. That is increasingly difficult. We are in a G0 as far as politics is concerned. I don't think that's going to increase in the next 10 years. So we need to find other ways to make the system work for more people. In the US now, for example, 60 million Americans live about $600 away from the poverty line. It just needs a car to break down or a medical emergency in the family, and they're toast. And toast in the US now means sleeping under the bridges in Seattle or in San Francisco or on the streets of Los Angeles, if you have been there recently. The American dream, I don't think exists for too many people anymore. So how do we create a system that works for many people? I think the first 2 bigger issues that we have, if we start with that, is climate change and inequality. They're actually related. They're 2 sides of the same coin. I would argue that the more we don't address the issues of climate change, the more people will be pushed into poverty. We're estimating that right now, more or less, where we're on the trajectory of 3.2 degrees to 3.5 degrees versus, frankly, 1.5 degrees only that we can afford, that we are in the next decade are pushing about 100 million people more in poverty. You might say that sounds like a big number, but just switch on your television. And every day you see the devastating effects of droughts, of floodings, and hurricanes and other adverse weather effects. The effects of pollution that come with climate change. Cities like Delhi had to be shut down. 8 million people prematurely losing their lives already now because of air pollution. The fluctuating costs of food that are affecting people, the spread of diseases that you see across the world, the increased levels of geopolitical uncertainty and conflicts and wars that are related to that. I don't think it's difficult for me to explain to you the 100 million number. The human caravan we now see in Latin America, for example, 2 or 3 decades ago, what a Peruvian fisherman could fish in 1 hour takes him now a day. If you're in Middle America and you are a cocoa or a coffee farmer, you're toast. You have to move. There's no way you can make a living anymore. 126 million people in the world now are migrants floating around the world, higher than at any time in human history. These numbers are only going up. Many of them already the origins in climate change. In fact, I would argue, and many people would argue, that the Middle East problems that you see, the disaster there, including Syria, had its origins actually in climate change, when there were significant droughts a few years before that made a lot of people migrate to the city, that then ultimately caused this spark that will have long and disastrous effects for humanity. So climate change is definitely the most burning issue in the world. And then the second one is income inequality. Income inequality is gone up everywhere. There's not one country, no one exception, where the Gini coefficient is moving in the right direction. Oxfam publishes a report always at the time of the World Economic Forum. And last year was quite shocking to me, but you see a reaction in the world that is muted, which surprises me. But the poorest 3.8 billion people in the world, the poorest half in the world, saw their net income go down by 11%. And the billionaires in this world saw their combined income go up 900 billion. The poorest got poorer by 11%. We've never seen that before. And the richer obviously get richer. The 900 billion that the billionaires got extra in 2018 would be enough to put, if you take the 900 billion, it's 2.5 billion a day more or less. The 2.5 billion a day would be enough to put all the 246 million children that are not in education in the world today into education. Would be enough to provide healthcare and save the lives of about 4 million children who now die before the age of 5. Would obviously be enough to ensure, more than enough, to ensure that the 826 million people that still go to bed hungry every day in this world, not even knowing if they wake up the next day, would be enough to provide them at least with the minimum dignity and respect of having food in their bellies before they go to bed. So there's something fundamentally wrong. We've created these islands of prosperity in an increasing sea of ocean. It's kind of cynical nearly that I missed being here with you because of the storms in the UK, which again I think are a direct effect of some of the things we've talked about, or indirect if you want to. And it nearly cancelled my flight coming in from the Cayman Islands, where British Airways cancelled the flight. So I had to scramble to find a fortune from Miami to be here with you. But the reason I was in the Cayman Islands was because it's a financial haven, and they had a lot of the people in the financial community to come together. And I thought it's important to speak to them, because if we don't change the financial world, it's very difficult to change our economic systems for companies as well. So it's a great target audience when there nowadays is trillions of dollars in the room, and where it seems everybody is a billionaire. I was glad that our airline, Cayman Airlines, could land on the airport and find its way through all the private planes that were parked there and make it safely. So that was already worth being thankful for. But there is a real problem in this world. And it's also amazing to see that when these people come together on this little island of prosperity, how little they know from what's happening in the real world. And frankly, I thank Newcastle for that, because this is the first time in my life when I was here that I saw people that were second generation unemployed, that had never seen their parents work. I was fortunate enough to never deal with it, but unfortunate enough to never think about it before. But it certainly got a light going in my head that said, hey, if we don't find systems that are more inclusive, it's not going to work. Too many people feel they're excluded or don't feel they participate, it ultimately will rebel. So that's really it. The 4 key challenges that we have, for the interest of time, that I think might be good to share with you is what is needed to change our economic system. I would single out the first one would be we need to decarbonize our economy. There's no question about that. And the current cost that we are incurring, by the way, already on a yearly basis because of climate change is estimated to be $5.3 trillion. Believe me or not, this is an IMF estimate, International Monetary Fund. The $5.3 trillion that we incur every year, because of climate change, and the numbers are going up, is more than what we would need to spend to avoid it in the first place. That's the silly thing in all of this. Which also means that it becomes easier for businesses to address. 70% of the world now would have wind and solar at lower prices than fossil fuel. So if we would get governments to work with us, which unfortunately isn't the case for the biggest governments, we could actually accelerate that transition and very much have a chance to stay below the 1.5 degrees, which means net zero emission by 2050. It means cutting in absolute the carbon emission every 10 years by 50% in absolute. Now it sounds like an audacious target, but it is by all means possible. And technology, obviously, is a big enabler of it. But we have a big task, that is to decarbonize the global economy. The second big task we have is to create a circular or regenerative economy. Earth Overshoot Day is a day that has been designed to tell you when we have in the year used up all the resources that Mother Nature can replenish. Obviously, we depend on nature. We are an integral part of nature. We would not be able to function if the planet doesn't function. Yet we're kind of idiots, if I may use that word. Hubert Reeves, who was a philosopher in Canada, said it very well when Hubert Reeves said, man is the most insane species. He worships an invisible God and destroys a visible nature, not realizing that the visible nature he destroys is the invisible God he worships in the first place. And this is what we are doing. We think we sort of have a supreme level above nature and can destroy and that would be fine. But nature is sending us its bills quite rapidly. And it's not a battle between man and nature, it's actually a battle for man. The IPBES report from the UN pointed out that even today, with the global warming we've already seen, we're losing about 1 million species at risk of extinction. In the Cayman Islands, by the way, that's called the blue iguana. There's 50 of them left. But it's everywhere. And 1 million species is about 10 to 100 times more than the normal historical pattern we've seen. The simple question you have to raise is, when is it our turn? So Earth Overshoot Day was last year, July 29th. Which means that we're using 70% more resources than this world already can replenish. And more seriously, we're getting too close to what people call negative feedback loops. Climate change makes the forests so dry that they actually become carbon emitters versus carbon sinks. Last year we had more forest fires, and the fires in Australia and all the other ones that you've seen obviously don't help, but they are net emitters of carbon. We are now seeing the borealis and the permafrost melting because of global warming, which releases methane. Methane is 25 times more potent than CO2, accelerating the global warming. We're close to a negative feedback loop on many of these things. Some argue a melting of the ice in the oceans makes the oceans, which are already absorbing way too much, as you see with the ocean warming and acidification, but making them absorb even more because you don't have the ice to reflect it. So we're close to a negative feedback loop. And some people like Johan Rockström, who teaches in the Potsdam Institute now, he was in the Stockholm Resilience Institute, would say that we are very close to these negative feedback loops, which will be very difficult to recuperate from. A simple example more would be air conditioners. Air conditioners basically work on HFC and CFC, not a good thing. Because it gets warmer, people have more air conditioners. Because we have more air conditioners, we bring in more HFC, CFC. That's a typical example of a negative feedback loop. And it's starting to happen in many of these areas. So we need to move not only to avoidance. If your Earth's overshoot day is July 29th, you need to actually start to think regenerative. If you don't think regenerative, you're not thinking aggressively enough. Companies also, less bad is certainly not good. How can you define less bad when we cannot afford to be worse than what we're currently doing? So you have to be neutral, but neutral is not enough if you're already using more of the Earth's resources than we can replenish. Now you might say, we'll find a solution, etc. Well, we could have also said that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 100 years ago. We clearly haven't found a solution, and millions of people pay the price for that. And it's usually the poor. That's why human development and climate change go hand in hand. So this overconsumption that is happening, by the way, just to put it in perspective, is currently only happening by 1.7 billion people in the world population. We have 7.8 billion people. And frankly, the 1.7 or 1.8 billion people consume 75% of the world's resources. So it's not that this is equally distributed. And the others aspire to do the same thing. It doesn't add up. It doesn't add up. As a result, we've done more damage to this planet Earth in the last 30 years of its existence than its 5 billion years of its existence. What gives us the right as this generation to do that and deprive future generations of the benefit of living on this planet Earth? It doesn't make any sense. So next to decarbonizing, and we're carbon junkies, so that's damn difficult, we need to move our economic systems to regenerative, not only circular economy, but regenerative. The third thing we need to do is provide some space. You cannot do these things in the rat race of quarterly profits. We've pumped so much money into the world, quantitative easing being one of them, but the liberation of financial markets well before that. It started really in the Clinton era with Greenspan, if you remember that, Paul Volcker actually, at that time, where the banks were all of a sudden allowed to do 10 million more things than we had invented them for. And before we knew it, they became big and powerful, and before we realized it, we were subservient to the financial markets. Versus what really the idea was, I think originally, was that the financial markets are subservient to the real economy. What I mean by this is very simple. The real economy is about $80 trillion in this world, but we've created financial instruments worth about $500 to $600 trillion. That's crazy. And that's why governments are totally potentless. They cannot do anything anymore, because that has taken on a whole different dimension that transfers boundaries. And any government that would attack that is worried about it. The financial power now way supersedes the real economy power. So if we don't make the financial sector again subservient to the real economy, we will not be able to address the issues. It's a major system change that needs to happen, that unfortunately most of the politicians, if not all, are too worried to attack, or out of fear of not getting re-elected again. Part of it being that a lot of the money is also having entered politics doesn't help. The US is a great example, where you currently now have to spend $3 to $5 billion to become a president. The campaign that is currently going on will be $10 billion. And by the way, the $10 billion is fought in about 4 or 5 swing states. You might as well give each of the person that lives in the swing state $100,000 and they'd be better off, and probably can give them more. So it's kind of a bizarre system that we have created. But the third thing after the climate change regenerative is to move these financial markets to the longer term and make them servant again to the real economy. You cannot solve the issues of climate change or food security or hunger on the rat race of the quarterly reporting. And the last thing we need to change is to make an economic system more inclusive, make it work for more people. Right now, all the rewards are in the capital market, and often in a way, in most countries, that there is no tax or obligation attached to that. Anybody that is playing the stock market right now, in most of the countries, or have the capital gains that come with equity growth, if you want to, will probably have a tax rate that is close to 0. And that, that tax system that was developed at the time when labor was scarce, now labor is abundant. So we have to reconfigure our tax system. It was designed at a time that material was abundant, now material is scarce. So you have to rechange our tax system. A price on carbon for that reason is a very good thing. We have to measure what we treasure. If you treasure cleaner air, if you treasure preservation of your resources, we have to put a price on that. If you don't put a price on that, you'll get abundancy of use and you'll get unintended consequences, or what seems increasingly as intended consequences. So these are 4 things that need to change. That's 4 major things. And it's very difficult to see governments do that, as I mentioned. Our governance system in the world was designed at the time of Bretton Woods in 1944, when, as a coincidence, 44 countries went together and created these institutions that are now known like the WTO, you know, the GATT and all these things were forerunners, the WTO or the OECD or the IMF or the World Bank, or I would argue the Security Council, and they don't reflect the real world anymore. They've not changed. For anybody who runs a company, since 1944, you've probably had 10, 15, 20 strategies to stay alive. The global governance has never been adjusted. So issues, at the same time that issues like cybersecurity, financial markets, climate change become more global, we don't have the institutions to deal with it. So we can sit here and say, these stupid politicians, vote them out of office, vote other ones in, become rebels and go to the extreme parties. Or we should say, we are citizens of this planet Earth. We care about the future of our children and their children. We have a responsibility to hand it over in a better shape than we found it, which I think is the minimum that we could do. We're in a position to do something about it, so we are going to take responsibility. And this brings me to the private sector. More companies need to understand that business cannot succeed in societies that fail either. Nor can business be a bystander in a system that gives them life in the first place. So to expect society to continue to bear the burden of all these externalities is totally ridiculous to even think that. And increasingly society is rebelling against it. Why do we see all the people in the street? Why do we see Greta doing a boycott of all the schools? And she's right, if we don't attack these issues, it doesn't make any sense to go to school. There won't be any planet. Why do employees start to speak up? We now have employee boycotts and walkouts at the rates that we've never seen before. Do you think that Jeff Bezos cared about climate change? I have bad news for you. He couldn't give a hoot. Couldn't give a hoot about it. But it's because 8,000 employees walked out that he didn't have a choice. So he makes a carefully timed commitment, which is still a commitment in the future. It's easy to say what you do in 2050. That needs to be translated in today. But it's because employees are walking out, be it against guns, be it against Me Too, or be it against climate change. That's an enormous pressure. And then if there is this false notion that the citizens of this world don't care, and the consumers who spend their money don't care, it's a false notion. By now the market for ethical products, or organics, or bio, or neighborhood farms, whatever you have in food, is growing exponentially. All the growth in most of the markets is going to more responsible social business models. You might not be at the tipping point in some of them, but it's absolutely going fast. And then, as I said, technology is coming increasingly in reach. The cost of solar or wind has come down 65% in the last 5 years alone. And some people haven't caught up to this yet. And it's crucial that we create a higher awareness, because the companies that don't will very quickly become dinosaurs. The companies that understand that and adapt will be very well placed for the future. And that bifurcation is starting to happen now. The average length of a publicly traded company was 67 years when I was born. It's dropped to 17 years today, because we simply don't know how to run it. The average length of a CEO has dropped to 4.5 years today, because we simply don't have the leaders that are capable to do this. So we need to create business people and business models that are adaptable to that future. At Unilever, we created a Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, decoupling growth from environmental impact, you know now why, and increasing overall social impact. We put targets around that might be a little bit difficult to understand for the financial market. But each of our brands had a social purpose. Domestos was not about cleaning toilets. Domestos was to build 100 million toilets and attack the issues of open defecation. A brand like Lifebuoy, a soap brand, was not just to wash your hands. It was to help a child reach the age of 5, when 4 million children still die because of infectious diseases like pneumonia or diarrhea. All of our brands became purpose-driven brands. And guess what? They're growing twice as fast and they're more profitable. And then your business model, you decouple that. Get to green energy. Be sure your factories don't run any waste. Be sure that in your value chain, you take responsibility of your total impact. Work deforestation, work human rights. Deal as much with the issues of food waste and obesity to solve them than you deal with the rest of your business. So your responsibility goes to your total impact that you have. Many companies still think today they can outsource their supply chain and by doing so also outsource their responsibilities. It doesn't work. My final 2 comments is that it becomes a much more attractive economic proposition. Unilever over the 10 years had a 300% rate of return, was growing at twice the rate of our competitors, and a return on invested capital of 19%, despite having done 52 acquisitions. It's a very profitable model. The reason that it is profitable to put the Sustainable Development Goals at the heart of your business model is because we've waited so long that the cost of not acting is actually higher than the cost of acting. I use the example of climate change. But let me take you one other example for the interest of time. To implement the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the follow-up to the Millennial Development Goals I talked about, in the next 15 years, irreversibly eradicate poverty in a more sustainable and equitable way, it costs about $3 to $5 trillion a year. We're only spending $1.5 trillion. So there's a big gap, a gap of 2 to 3 trillion if you follow me. Normally you say that should be governments, but I have bad news for you. Governments only spend $160 billion on ODA, overseas development aid, and these numbers are going down. Another reason why the private sector has to come in. So the private sector has to finance this 2 to 3 billion, a trillion gap, 2 to 3 trillion gap. On all of the development goals, we are now incurring costs that are higher than the 2 to 3 trillion. Goal number 16 is peace and justice. It deals with rule of law, absence of war, access to legal systems. This world currently spends 8 to 10% of its global GDP, 8 to 10% of its global GDP on conflict prevention and wars. That's $8 trillion. Up to $8 trillion is 3 times the cost what it would be to implement all the Sustainable Development Goals. I gave you the example of climate change, but the same is true for many of the other goals. We are incurring costs right now that are significantly higher than what it would cost us to solve. And then we give ourselves still the label of being the most intelligent species. So this is what we need to change. The systems changes. You cannot do that from within the system. You need to work on the system. And some of these 4 changes I mentioned. Now, my final comment is, and this is not helping the universities, this university has rapidly increased the number of PhDs, 55, now 155, lots more research. It's moved the rankings up. We need that, so don't misunderstand my comment here. But to solve the world's problems of hunger, inclusion, poverty, climate change, we actually don't need more PhDs, or we don't need more people going to Mars or Pluto, because we have the answers. We know how to build houses, yet the homeless go up. We know how to produce food without cutting forests. And frankly, we know how to build toilets as well, and yet we still have 1.5 billion people that deal with the terrible issues of open defecation. So it's not that we don't know what to do. What is missing is human willpower. And human willpower itself is a renewable resource. And the question is, that's why I like it, to be honest. And the question really here is, do we really care? We have distilled humanity and business to such an inhumane level of a few numbers and computers and fast trading in the financial markets, or a narrow definition of what success looks like, where we've measured self-worth by net worth and not by making this world better for everybody. So how do we create the right leaders? Leaders that understand by putting the interest of others ahead of their own, they'll be better off themselves as well. Leaders that can think intergenerational. Leaders that are more purpose-driven. Leaders that understand that they have to work in a different form of partnership to solve these issues, because clearly we're not able to solve it alone. These are the type of leaders that we need to create, and that's why it's so important that we're here today and support these institutions that obviously have to create the leaders. So changing the universities is a big part of that, but unfortunately, at the speed and scale or the time that we have, it will not be the only solution that we can rely on, because we're now working on a timeline that is pretty tight, to be honest, in terms of starting to see the changes. That's why I created Imagine as a foundation, and benefit cooperation, where we actually work with industry sectors to make the CEOs more courageous, get enough CEOs together, 20 to 25% of a whole value chain in an industry, fashion, food, travel and tourism, and drive tipping points. Once you get 25 to 30% of an industry to move and you create tipping points, the rest will follow. Governments will put frameworks in place that make sense. NGOs, civil society want to be part of it. So you accelerate the change towards the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And that is really what Imagine is working on. So at least I got my 2 minutes from Imagine. I've been told the time is up, so we'll use the rest of the time for the Q&As. And we can go 5 minutes over if that's okay with you. Who wants to kick it off? Okay, so anybody?
Thank you very much, Polman. Questions? I'm sure there are some. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Lizzie Dunn and I work for the North Tyne Combined Authority, which is a newly formed authority here in the North East. My question is, how can organisations like mine and local authorities help make these changes and help with businesses incorporating the Sustainable Development Goals?
Yeah, that's a good question. Can I take 2 or 3 questions? Is that okay with you?
Anything else? Yes, yeah.
What was your name again?
Yeah, can you give us your name and who you are?
Of course. Hi, my name's Ewan. It's E-U-A-N, with a strange spelling. I'm a university alumni here. Just wanted to ask a few interesting points, especially around moving the financial market focus from the short term to the long term. Can you tell us a little bit about when you were at your time at Unilever, how you gained traction on that kind of, the shift of focus from perhaps the typical kind of KPIs and metrics to the more sustainable focus goals?
We have another question here.
Don't make it too tough, huh?
No, I'll try not to. Kevin Carrot, JK Property Consultants. I do a lot of regeneration, economic and job creation, and one of the biggest challenges is how do you change what I would call the Victorian-style construction sector into something that's innovative and achieves the sustainable goals that you espouse.
Yeah. Okay, all very good questions. So let me just get to each of them. They're quite different because sometimes I try to combine, but here it doesn't quite work. So I apologize for that. But the first one is, most of the action happens on the ground. And what we now see is with governments having a hard time to work together, and frankly a little bit too far removed from the real citizens of this world, most of that is happening at sub-national level, at local or city level. So the Pact of Mayors has been formed, for example, that has now over 300 cities that work together on climate change and what we need to do. I apologize, I don't know if Newcastle itself is part of that, but it's a C40, they called it, because it started with the biggest 40 cities. But what you now see in the US for climate change, for example, on the one hand you have Donald Trump, clearly a climate denier, working very hard to take the science out, to put PERFA subsidies in place, pushing blindly coal because it's a swing state for him in his elections, and really pushing water uphill, getting out of the Paris Agreement. Despite that, 75% of the US economy is actively working on and actually running ahead of the Paris Agreements on climate mitigation, because it's happening at a sub-national level, state of California being obviously a front runner there, but also at the city level, where you see many things. So I don't know exactly your new organization and its reasons, but tie it in with others to create these regional networks, just like the Pact of Mayors, because there's a lot of thinking and new things coming in. One of the main things that is happening, coming to the buildings first, is urbanization. Over the next, we just passed the 50% of people living in cities, and the world is going to 70%, 75% of people living in cities. So if you make the calculation of the world population going from 7 billion to 10 billion, and from 50% in cities to 70% in cities, you will find out, if you do that calculation, that we are actually going to double the number of people living in cities versus where we are today, which is a frightening prospect, because it means we have to build as many cities in the world still as we have today. And how we are building those cities, how we are building, is going to decide really if we exist or not. It might sound a little bit frightening, but London, the road system in London is still from the Roman times. And we're here close to the Hadrian Wall, doesn't move either. So, you know, many of these things, once you put in infrastructure, is tight. In the next 15 years, we'll be spending globally $90 trillion on infrastructure. So greening our infrastructure, of which obviously energy source, because you have to move energy to green energy, energy efficiency, buildings is a very important part. Now the good news is that we now have already big building companies, like for example Dahlia in India, which is a big company, and a country, India, which is still developing or intermediate, already making commitments that in the construction they can be carbon positive. There's now cement that can actually absorb CO2. So here again, technology goes very far. There are steel companies, aluminum companies, airlines now. So these are called the high emitting or abatement sectors that are actually making zero commitments. It's very important to us because we're looking at these sectors, creating these hero CEOs and commitments to tell the others if they can, why can't you? So building efficiency is probably one of the fastest growing professions and a very profitable one. Because I would argue, and I've seen with Unilever, we made all of our internal energy use net zero. All of our buildings are LEED, platinum LEED or gold LEED. And many of the buildings we had to convert. I actually never had to pay capital. I always found companies that were willing to put the capital in to convert these buildings, and then the payout is obviously a longer term contract with energy savings. It's a no-brainer because these buildings are so inefficient. 80% of the energy use in the cities that is wasted goes through buildings now. So governments need to have active programs. When I moved to London and bought a house, and I'm part of the Cadogan estate where our house is, but the government, the local government, prohibited us to change our windows because they were protected. I said, you guys are crazy. And then they said you couldn't put solar panels on the roof because that was sort of, you know, nobody can see my roof, by the way, except seagulls who happily enjoy it. Not us, but the seagulls do. But it's, you know, you can't even put, so I had to change that. I said to them, you must be absolutely bananas and not to have us put double windows. I'll pay for it myself because I wanted to show that my whole house could be carbon zero in terms of emissions. It helps that I'm only there 30% of the time. I didn't tell them that. But we can do it. So, and I tell my wife to keep wearing her coat when she runs around the house. That's a joke. But we have to have government policies that understand that and much more actively stimulate that. And when you have things like in the UK, your Victorian buildings, greens, brown sites or whatever you call it, we need to have extra help from the governments to make these transitions. And some governments have caught on to that. In some countries, the French, the Dutch, have probably laws in place already that are more aggressive. Now, the good thing now is that you have a prime minister that makes bold statements. He's willing to invest over 100 billion to get you a half hour quicker in Newcastle. I could buy into that one, but to spend the half of it is 50 billion to get me quicker to London, I still don't understand it. So perhaps we can just spend half the money and get us here. But someone hasn't figured that out yet. But you know, instead of that, he also has to host the COP26 in Glasgow, not far from here. The climate change, absolutely crucial in a year of delivery. And he's willing to make bolder statements around climate change that all of a sudden is a priority for him. So perhaps the building sector can get organized better and put some energy behind that. Then in terms of the long-term focus, yeah, it is tough. The markets are actually getting more short-term instead of longer term. There's no question about it. But for example, what we did in Unilever, we stopped quarterly reporting. We stopped giving guidance. I said these investors we like, these investors we don't like. I spend a lot of time on trying to attract the longer term investors. Most CEOs don't take the time for that. So we fundamentally changed our investor base and our incentive base, our compensation base. And then you need to communicate to the market why that longer term is better. Not to say, trust me and come back in 10 years. We still had to perform every year, but certainly not every quarter. I wasn't going to do my job by telling them Ramadan was a day earlier or the weather was bad, so I sold a little bit less ice cream. I wasn't planning to spend my life that way. So I told them that it's not interesting. What we then found was when we only communicate once or twice a year, the communication becomes more strategic. You also attract more strategic shareholders. And what has been proven by McKinsey and others, there's some Harvard Business Review articles, that companies that are run for the longer term are actually also more profitable. Like companies that have a stronger purpose, not surprising, you attract the right people, other things. Or companies that are more diverse and use, the combined strengths of men and women or people with disabilities are better off than, it's like playing tennis with one hand behind your back. So to move the markets to the longer term, you need to do some things. But you need to work it in your company. Often compensations of CEOs are perverse. They stimulate short-term behavior, heavily linked towards stock options or share buybacks or earnings per share. So boards often are under pressure. They don't like that because they have a closer link to the financial community. 75% of CEOs say it comes from the boards. So we do a lot of board training and changing corporate governance. And then the investment community, the asset managers, the BlackRocks, the State Streets, the Fidelities, they're actually, many of them are still incentivized on a quarterly basis. We all like to open our statement every quarter to see if the money that we put in went up. And the same companies, for example, that complain about the short-termism, it's their pension funds. Unilever had a 26 billion pension fund. It's their pension funds that are often incentivized on the short term. So you need to move these asset managers to the longer term as well. And now we're working with the asset owners, which are more important. The asset owners, which is basically telling the asset owners, can we create a big enough coalition that forces that change also on the asset managers? The reason Larry Fink starts to write these letters now is not because Larry Fink is all of a sudden, went to the Blues Brothers and saw the light. It's because he gets pressure from the asset owners. For example, the Japanese investment fund, GPIF, under a guy called Hiro Mizuno, is very aggressive, and they have nearly $2 trillion under management. So when they move 100 billion, it hurts. So we are using the asset owners to drive that change. But you need to work it on all these levels, at the CEO company level, board level, asset manager level, asset owner level, and slowly move that forward. It will take a while because some of these jurisdictions, like the American jurisdiction, has a slightly different philosophy. But interestingly, we now got 181 companies with the Business Roundtable in the US to make a commitment to go to a longer-term multi-stakeholder model. So even there, the debate has started. And whilst I don't agree much with Donald Trump, he actually is interested in moving the financial markets also to the longer term, surprisingly. I don't know if he has the same objectives as I do for this, but at least here we have come together as friends. We'll take one or two quickly.
Take one more question from here, please.
Denise Jones, MBA student from Newcastle University. I'm interested to know, have you seen any metrics that allow us to monitor the change in power of financial markets over the real market?
Yeah, so I'll take one or two more quickly, very quickly.
I think we're going to have to close. I think we're just, sorry, Powell.
Go on one, the audience votes.
Who's the winner?
I need gender balance for sure. I will not leave without gender balancing questions.
Hi, you've talked a lot about global warming and climate change, and I'd like to bring you back to focusing on food and food insecurity. And given that we've now got a national food strategy launched in the UK, and there's lots of consultation about that, how would you envisage a food system which is equally and socially just? So when we're looking actually at those that are more than likely to go into poverty over the next few years, the predictions are that we're going to have 5.2 million children in poverty in the next 5 years. How would you ensure a system that those that are at the bottom of the socioeconomic status get access to healthy and affordable food?
Yeah. So starting with the food system, right now the food system obviously isn't working. It's probably one of the most broken systems in the world. From all aspects, by the way, with a cost that is infinitely higher. We've done some analysis that the world is currently paying about $12 trillion because of the broken food system. In stunting, in obesity, in people going to bed hungry, food deficiency, nutritional deficiency obviously being very big, in deforestation, affecting livelihoods of indigenous people, 1 billion in the world that depend on the forest. So whatever data you look at, if you come from Mars, you think we're just absolutely nuts. So one of the things we have created is a food and land use coalition where we look at this horizontally. so that we can get the parties to work together. And that's a very important thing to do. And with an objective is to create more jobs for smallholder farmers, Africa being the priority. They're going to 2 billion people, plus half the world's youth will be in Africa. They're importing food right now, and they can create jobs for themselves. So bringing Africa back to food sufficiency and creating jobs for smallholder farmers is a very important part of what we need to look at. So we start with healthy food, we start with accessible food, we start with saving the earth. So there's a big movement now coming in on regenerative agriculture, because people are starting to understand also that the best solution for climate change, not the only one, but the best solution is actually natural solutions. What we have created is an incredible invention that takes care of itself, captured more over time, grows by itself. It's called a tree. But, and that's probably the best solution for carbon change. So if we can use agriculture in its broader sense, including the biodiversity protection, biodiversity services in this world right now are $125 trillion. So if we can find a way to find financing for biodiversity protection, we can actually bring that into food. And I'll give you a specific example where we will make food, move it in the direction of regenerative, which also requires you to get out of monocrop. The reason we have 160 million children stunted every year, and farmers in subsistence, 85% of the poor people in this world are subsistence farmers, is because of land degradation and monocrop. So that's the part you have to change. Not actually with subsidies. We are spending far more money on the European, 30% of the European budget, for example, on per first farm subsidies than that it would cost to address these issues. So it's not for more money. I will never argue for more money. I'll argue if we spend money better. But for example, we are now, next week I'm in Papua and West Papua helping the government. They have given out 60% of the forest in concessions that will be palm oil or other things. We will be toast. We only have the Congo basin, the Amazon, which Bolsonaro is destroying right now like you wouldn't believe it. Deforestation up 90% versus a year ago. And then we have Papua and West Papua. So we have to protect these forests, unwind these concessions, and find alternative sources of income. One of the things we're now looking at is Microsoft. You might have seen Microsoft's announcement to be carbon neutral, but not only be carbon neutral, to recuperate all the carbon since the company started in 1975. So we will see the market of carbon developing fairly quickly. So if you can get carbon financing, so for example, you take the mangroves in Indonesia. If we can say to Indonesia, you protect your mangroves, which is, by the way, 30% of the mangroves globally, and high carbon capture, as you probably know. But we pay them for those services to protect it. And the payments come from companies that want to be carbon neutral, or actually carbon positive, go beyond or recuperate what they've done. So you create financial markets that stimulate that. You can do the same in agriculture. I don't think you'll get away with it anymore in the future. My vision is if your agriculture actually has a negative carbon footprint. It should actually be positive, if you think about that. So we are now working ourselves with Imagine. We brought the food companies together, big food companies, like Bayer, like Syngenta, like Nestle, Danone, Unilever, but also the big traders like Cargill, ADM, Dreyfus, Bunge, and bring them all together, the value chain, and get to this tipping point on regenerative and job creation, which we call a new social contract, so that we have livelihoods and climate change.
So that's almost like an investment in climate, but also human capital.
100%. So that's why with Imagine we focus on climate change and inequality. So it goes together with a new social contract, otherwise you won't get there. And then the final one is the metrics. So a very good thing in the UK right now is actually started by Aviva on a thing I did with Mark Malloch-Brown. I asked him to look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which are 17 goals, 169 targets, quite some complexity. Business doesn't understand that. It's too much for a CEO. The average CEO might remember the name of his wife, how much money he makes and what business he's in, but that's about it. So we use Mark Malloch-Brown to simplify that. And out of that, with Aviva, Mark Wilson, came a project which is called the World Benchmark Alliance. that you need to Google, World Benchmark Alliance, that is a very, taken off now, it's very elaborate and very detailed on measuring not only the short and long term, but the company's contributions towards the SDGs, so that becomes an investment criteria. In 50 years ago, 80% of a company's value was into tangibles and fixed assets. And that's how the financial market started. Now that's only 20%. So the financial market has basically become a Las Vegas. And we need to value again the missing 80%, which is company culture, which is IP, which is quality of people, which is reputation, which is value chain, and all the other things. And that's what we're trying to do there, so that also then the financial market can make the right decisions and move that to the longer term. And separately, we have some indexes that we can see where actually the velocity of trading is actually, unfortunately, with all the money pumped in since the financial crisis, there's far more money, half the world's money now has 0 or negative interest rates. So they're chasing shorter and shorter term to get a return. They're willing to break up companies to get 1% more, not really caring about what the function of those companies is. So the financial market, unfortunately, the bad news I have to share with you is getting shorter and shorter term. And it needs more regulation, I think, and more concerted efforts to attack that. Part of that, we're working with the financial community. We've created a group that you should also Google, which is called FCLT, which stands for Focusing Capital on the Long Term, where we're trying to educate the financial industry and especially, again, use some of these examples that I said with asset managers or other things to move the market to the longer term. Bad news is, unfortunately, I hate to end with bad news, but it's currently not yet going in the right direction. We haven't bent the curve there yet, which is a challenge, but we should not give up on that. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being here. Thank you for what you're doing.
Speaker is thanked for giving a wide-ranging talk. It usually means that the chair has no idea what they spoke about and can't think of anything else to say. In this particular case, I think it's absolutely evident what we have seen is something which is very wide-ranging. We've seen things at the macro level. We've seen something which is content-rich, and we have seen something which is philosophically deep. I think what we've seen this evening has been a fantastic presentation coupled with questions and answers. Should we just say thank you? Before everybody goes, earlier I gave you a list of things which explain why we had sustainability at the top of our agenda. One of the reasons that I pulled out from my speech from Professor Beadle over there was that it's one of the things that we do is we work with the North East Initiative for Business Ethics. So, Caroline Theobald will now close the session. Caroline.
Oh, George, thank you very much. Actually, I thought you said it all. And what I was going to say was almost exactly the same as you. I'm going to take a lead from you, Paul. I have to keep it simple. You've given us so much to think about that I think to try and make it complicated would not do anyone any good at all. So, with 3 hats on, you know from earlier I'm the chair of the the Business Advisory Board at the Business School. And it's been fantastic for me as a director of North East Initiative on Business Ethics to see just how much is happening both in the business school and university-wide, the leading role that they have in achieving putting sustainable development goals at the heart and centre of the university strategy. We also talked about me being a business owner, a small business owner. You've talked about corporates, you've talked about the importance of reaching a tipping point to get other people to buy into your vision. We all know that in the UK, 93.3% of businesses are small businesses. What we're trying to do at the North East Initiative on Business Ethics is get some of these messages out there, that it makes more sense now to invest in good business behaviour, because it costs less than not doing anything. It's not the easiest message to get across. You've given us a lead, the work you've done at Unilever, some of the stuff that is now at last beginning to happen. But may I encourage you, ladies and gentlemen, to sign up with GDPR technology. We can't put you on our database unless you put your names on these forms. And we're doing some quite interesting stuff. So I think we were asked, Ron and I, before you came, to think about some examples of where good behaviour was happening. Well, I think you'd agree that Walgreens Boot Alliance are doing some quite useful stuff. They're going to be speaking at, we talked about Partnership 2 at Durham University Business School on the 2nd of March. Bruin, one of those investment houses, is sponsoring Where Are the Folk from Emmanuel College? We've got a debate, 5 of the region's schools are thinking about future business leaders. This House believes data and tech companies are a threat to our democracy. That's being sponsored by Bruin. That's on the 3rd of the 3rd. And then the business editor of The Spectator is here in conversation with industrialist Gordon Black at the end of the month on the 26th to talk about his new book, The Good, the Bad and the Greedy. Purpose, sustainability and fair balance of reward. So hopefully you can see we're trying to do something up here. We're trying to get as many of you involved as possible because it's only when we all get involved as citizens, as business owners, that things will change. And isn't it extraordinary that I'm certainly more convinced by Greta Thunberg than I am the President of the United States? Thanks again for joining us and coming back to the people who gave you your first honorary degree. It's quite something, Powell. I hope you're going to come again. Thank you.